So welcome everyone to our April 2024 iteration of our Ask NPSMA webinar. And today we have a guest speaker. So we're going to be hearing about artificial intelligence in hiring, considerations for the education to work pipeline. And we're excited to have Chris with us. So before we jump into the content, just a few things to mention. We have our 2024 National Conference and Workshop on building a STEM master's program community within the NPSMA, with the NPSMA, and that's going to be November 6th to 9th, 2024. And some of the people on this webinar are very familiar with the venue. So that will be in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we encourage all to join. Does anybody on the planning committee have any quick things you might want to plug about the national meeting?
Jerry, you want to say something?
Sure. Thanks, Seema, and thanks, Marcel. So very briefly, as the title indicates, this is the first national conference since the NPSMA changed its name and expanded its purview to extend beyond the traditional PSM programs to all M.S.STEM programs. So we really are looking for a broad-based attendance at the conference, and I'm sure our out-of-town guests, especially if you've never been to Philadelphia, will certainly enjoy the venue. So we look forward to seeing everyone there, and the preliminary programs will be posted shortly. So thanks to all who have already contributed ideas, and see you in November in Philly.
Perfect. Thank you, Jerry. So if you're interested in keeping current in the PSM world, we have our monthly PSM news, which comes in email. And if you're interested, I'll put my email address in the comments after I finish this. Feel free to email me if you would like to be added to that. We also have The Innovator, which is our publication where best practices can be shared. And we also have The Chronicle, which is a publication where we can feature your PSM alumni and graduates. So again, you can get in touch with me about any of these things. If you're interested in getting involved with the NPSMA, you can volunteer for NPSMA committees. If there's a particular project you might want to be involved in, again, ask me, any board member, but I will also put my email down. We encourage you to become a member of the NPSMA if you aren't already. So we offer reduced rates to the conferences, in particular, the one that we were just talking about, that Jerry was describing in November in Philadelphia. We have presentation opportunities for PSM students at that annual meeting. We have a close relationship with the Council of Graduate Schools, which can open up opportunities for presentations and NSF grants. And case in point, we have our monthly Ask NPSMA webinars, which are recorded and published on our YouTube channel, so you can look at past Ask NPSMA sessions if you're interested. And we also have done virtual focused recruitment fairs as well. We have our social media footprint, so connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, aforementioned YouTube channel, and also on LinkedIn to keep up to speed on what's happening with the NPSMA. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Chris. So Chris is coming from Jefferson, so Philadelphia University and Thomas Jefferson University. And yeah, Chris, I think we can turn it over to you. Let me stop sharing here.
Thank you, Marcel. And thank you to Dr. Grunwald, to Jerry, for inviting me into this process, this conversation with you all. My goal today is to move fairly quickly through the slides I have. This is a much larger workshop that I've both pared down and then added more hiring content, or some hiring content into. So my goal is to move through so we can get to more of a conversational space in kind of the second half. And right now I'm just fiddling with Zoom, since Zoom likes to make us fiddle with things. Okay. So a little bit about me, for those of you that, unlike Tim, who may not have gone onto my LinkedIn account to poke around, which, by the way, career development folks, Tim, love to hear that. Check out your LinkedIn. That warms our hearts. So good to know it's getting some use out there, even if you're going to get on this call and make fun of my dorm from our shared alma mater. So just to give you a little background on who I am and where this information is coming from. I started my journey both in career development within a university setting, but also in the technology side of the field back in 2002, where I built the first online career center in the country. And there was a lot we were doing with assessing social media, which was very new at the time, looking at the early online platforms, adapting Blackboard, which was our LMS at that school, for delivering services and so on, and various more recent things. And all along the way, I've been asked to or have been given the opportunity to do sessions like this in a variety of formats. So I come to you not as a, ooh, I heard about this Chat GPT a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to do a talk on it, but been watching this unfold for a while now. So I'm going to ask you all to drop in the chat. Well, you don't have to, but if you want to take a guess at who said this to us, whose quote this is, please drop that in the chat. Give you a minute or so to think about that. Okay. There's some Philadelphia love coming in. Okay. Vinci. All right, we're reaching back. All right. This is actually Martin Luther King Jr. He was in the final year of his life. He was pivoting his work in civil rights to engage with labor unions, and the world of work as part of the civil rights scope. And in his conversations over many years with organized labor in the United States, was seeing a lot of confluence in terms of concerns, and saw that as one route to establishing better civil rights within the country. And so, but what I find interesting about this is 60 years ago, we had people in our country speaking to the moment we're in right now, and the concerns that we have. These are not new. We can go further back and see, the responses to different stages of the Industrial Revolution as well. And I think it's important for us to kind of set that context and that understanding that we're not in a new moment. There are maybe some new iterations of it, but the challenges have been the same for a long time. What we're going to be covering, I'm going to skim through a brief history of algorithmic technologies, or AI, some of the concerns and impacts that have kind of arisen along the way. Although most of you may be familiar with it, we're going to do a very brief primer on different kinds of AI that we are facing. ChatGPT seems to have taken up all of the oxygen in the room for the last year, but it is certainly not the first and not the only version of things out there. We'll talk briefly about the political landscape, because all of these things impact our conversation around AI and algorithms in the hiring and management space. We'll touch on some ethical dimensions that kind of extend from this, and notes on the WGA strike. And then from there, I would like to move to whatever questions are burning in your minds, see if I can step in and help answer some of those. So that's what we're aiming for the next hour. In 1956, as a term was coined at a gathering at Dartmouth. And although Alan Turing had been working, and others have been working on the technologies that started to become this within computer science, this is where the term in the modern vision for AI really emerges. And in 1964, we have a computer scientist at MIT, Weizenbaum, who created ELIZA, which was essentially the first chatbot. And in his experiences with that and some of the other things he was doing in his labs, he actually pivoted to become one of the leading critics of AI, and what he saw as a trajectory that it was going to take society, or rather that people would use to take society in. And a lot of his criticisms from the 60s and early 70s have actually started to play out. Fast forwarding a little bit, and in the 90s, we see, because of the rise of the internet, employers are seeing massive increases in applications because suddenly people from everywhere can find you've got jobs posted. And so instead of getting jobs from a local group because people are finding your job posting in a local newspaper, the whole world, the whole nation has access. And so applications rise dramatically, and applicant tracking systems emerge as a response to that. They were used to control the flow of information. They had previously existed as internal tools for human resources, but it's in the 90s that we see them becoming the public-facing portals that we know today. And we also see them as starting to be used as candidate filtering and selection tools as well. So the technology is there, suddenly starts to shape, and early algorithmic decision-making systems or early AI are being used then in the 90s to help with this process. These are the two launch dates for CAPTCHA and reCAPTCHA. And we know these well because they're used all the time to protect websites from crawlers and bots. But we also need to pay attention to, and there's been a number of articles that have been done on this, that they're also used to gain free human labor for training data in order to be used in tech detection in the case of CAPTCHA and computer vision AI in the case of reCAPTCHA. So think of all the times you want to access a website and you have to go through this and there's not a workaround or an opt-out to get access. That data is being fed back into systems to train AIs in those areas. In 2017, we have the founding of the AI Now Institute, which was originally affiliated with New York University. Co-founders Meredith Whittaker, which was a former Google AI researcher, and Kate Crawford, who was a former Microsoft researcher. AI Now has, since its inception, offered research-based critiques of algorithmic technologies, and they regularly work with governments on policy and regulatory frameworks to highlight and mitigate known and potential harms from these kinds of systems in hiring and elsewhere in society. Google walkouts, just as a note, in 2018, because we start to see some interesting moves of organizing labor in white-collar spaces, which is atypical for US history. And then also in that year, we have the publication of Algorithms of Oppression by Safia Noble. And this is one of the first books researching and detailing harms of algorithmic decision-making systems. And although it's not related to her work, it does build on the 2016 ProPublica article that investigated and identified racial bias that had become embedded in a system that was used by multiple state justice departments in predicting prison recidivism. Automating inequality, race after technology, and the Big Nine are kind of next steps. Other scholars leaning in are following the footsteps of Algorithms of Oppression in investigating where these things are going to take us. The Big Nine is actually work by futurist Amy Webb and looks at multiple scenarios, as any good futurist would, of where these things may take us based on where we're at today. And all of these are worth taking a look at if you kind of want to get a better handle on how we've gotten to where we are and where we're likely to be going. In 2020, Timnit Gebru was Google's chief AI ethics researcher, and she co-authored what's been colloquially known as the Stochastic Parrots paper. In that paper, she and her co-authors warned of the dangers of the current path of LLM, or large language model development. She was working on these things. Her job was to be an internal watchdog and warning system for where Google was going with things, and she was terminated for doing her job. This is a trend we start to see with the Google walkouts in 2018. Many of the people that walked out were fired, and they actually were investigated by the National Labor Relations Board and faced sanctions for their treatment of employees. This is a trend that we need to pay attention to. In 2021, Joy Buolamwini's documentary Coded Bias, based on her research at MIT, comes out and actually brings in research from other researchers working on algorithmic systems as well, and where they can become problematic. In 2022, we're going to cover more of this, but this is when the White House releases the framework for an AI Bill of Rights. I mentioned this in a lot of spaces. Most people I talk to about this are unaware this came out. It precedes ChatGPT by about a month, and is a fairly significant and substantial document. But like I said, we'll get into that a little bit more as we move on. After that, we see Galactica make its debut. It's touted by Meta or Facebook as an LLM that will revolutionize the literature review of research and even create new novel research. It failed quickly and spectacularly in a very public way at matching its marketing hype, and Meta withdrew it very quickly in response. OpenAI, fast on the heels of that, releases the best known of its LLMs, ChatGPT, which was, I think, 3.5 at the time. They've got to 4, and there's another version that has come out, and they've also been releasing video imaging ones as well. So we've got those kind of suddenly changing the conversation and kicking that into overdrive. 2023, very early in the year, the race to market leads both Google and Microsoft, who is the major stakeholder in OpenAI, to disband their product ethics teams because they were creating too much friction in the pipeline to market. Remember Timnit Gebru being fired as an ethicist for being an ethicist? Product teams that were supposed to ensure public safety of products were released by their companies in order to reduce the time to market, because the race to market was so heated going into February and March of last year. In May, we see Congress make its first moves towards addressing AI. It's a lot faster than the response Congress has had towards data privacy, which at this point is still kind of non-existent compared to where the European Union is. But then, for that matter, the European Union has also passed policy and regulatory frameworks on AI just earlier this year, too. And this past year, we've seen higher education respond more rapidly than we usually do in response to this, but the conversations rarely seem to take into account the depth of existing research or emerging policies. Like I've said, in the spaces I've been in, the conversations I've had, and they've been extensive, mentioning of things like the White House framework for an AI Bill of Rights is usually unknown. And these things, I think, we need to be looking at to inform what we're doing. I'm raising your attention to them because they are informing where I am coming from and what I'm bringing to you, and how these conversations, how they could impact things if we are not engaging with them now. Because they are likely to shape the future and could lead to more work for us as we have to pivot away from choices we've started to make or paths we started to go down. So I'm sure all of you know this, covering it just in case, but AI broadly are just computer-coded algorithms that are trained on data sets to replicate some kind of decision-making process. We've seen these for years in Netflix suggestions and how Twitter and Instagram will populate our feeds. They also show up in all autocomplete and autocorrect tools when we're writing an email or a text. Computer vision systems show up in the work on self-driving cars, in video hiring tools and video proctoring systems like Proctorio. And even Zoom, about a year ago, during 2021, was starting to explore using facial recognition and computer vision tools to improve marketing calls, to give feedback on the engagement and potentially the emotional state of the people on those calls. It's worth noting that researchers in the social sciences that work very heavily on things like emotional detection and so on, have been calling foul on these systems because it's nearly impossible to do that. And that's even if you had a normative baseline, which we don't have, because you start to factor in racial distinctions, cultural distinctions, neurodivergency, somebody who maybe has suffered a stroke or otherwise has partial paralysis on their face, and so on. These systems fail quickly, but it doesn't stop organizations from rolling these out and claiming that they work. But again, the science does not support that. But the market is the market, and we need to understand that because this stuff comes into the hiring space. The more recent entries, of course, in AI have been the generative AI tools. These are ChatGPT, Bard, Galactica, and so on, and the ones that have come since in the past year. These are the large language models. They use probability to replicate plausible text strings based on user prompts that add context and rules to however the algorithms already operate. So when we're putting a prompt in there, or we're working with different prompts and refining that, we're basically setting boundaries and rules for the system to try and give us something that matches what our expectations are. On the visual side, are these and similar systems that work in the same way as the LLMs, but they're trained on enormous amounts of images, or in some of the cases with the very newest things like Sora, which came out of OpenAI, short video clips. And they are used to generate images or short videos that, again, meet the parameters of a user's prompt. In all cases, the data sets involved scraping enormous amounts of data from the internet without consent or compensation to the content creators. So if you've got something out there, it probably got pulled in whether you knew it or liked it or not. And in fact, the CEO behind Stable Diffusion bragged on Twitter last spring that if you know what you're doing, you can go behind the firewalls to get at private data. And in a recent interview, OpenAI's CTO, Chief Technology Officer, could not answer whether they had used YouTube content, which would have been a violation of YouTube's terms of service, to get training data for their image tools. Most of the indications from researchers looking at these tools say they absolutely had to have, because of what is produced out of these systems. Finally, when we talk about AI, these tools roughly fall into one of three categories. Artificial narrow intelligence, this is what we have now at various levels, and embeddedness in the tools we use. You know, going back to those early applicant tracking systems and other things to, you know, what Microsoft has been rolling out. So when we are, you know, typing an email, we get much more that showing up as suggestion than we used to get. They do one thing, ANIs do one thing. They cannot deviate from that function. They are really bound by their training data. AGI, or general intelligence, is the theoretical approximation of human level of intelligence, and it shows adaptability, self-learning, and so on. This is the goal that a lot of organizations have set. There is a lot of contention over whether it's even possible or achievable, with a lot of cognitive scientists, the majority of cognitive scientists saying it can't be done, and computational computer scientists saying that it can. I will leave that to other researcher-oriented minds to say, where's the evidence going with this? But it's also, is ANI enough? And that's one of the questions out there too. Do we really need AGI, or can ANI just fill in what we actually need for most of our work? ASI is superintelligence, and now we're talking the Matrix or Terminator level independent agent that is beyond our human capabilities and probably even beyond our comprehension. And notably, publicly, leaders on the drive for AI, such as Sam Altman, believe that this ASI is going to happen and are trying to make sure that it doesn't kill us all. So then that's a whole fun rabbit hole you can dive down. I'm not going to take us there. But it's worth noting, where are the minds at? What are they thinking of, the people that are developing it, bringing these into the public sphere? So, political landscape. December 2021, going back 3 whole years, and we have the first piece of proposed legislation on algorithms in the United States coming out of DC Attorney General's office. This legislation would make it illegal for businesses and organizations to use discriminatory algorithms, whether it's intentional or not, in 4 key areas of life opportunities: education, employment, housing, and public accommodations and services, which would include credit, healthcare, and insurance access. A couple key features in this legislation was that, one, it tied it to existing civil rights legislation. And second, it was groundbreaking in using broad technology terms rather than naming specific tools or processes. In other words, this was legislation that was proposed that would have been structured to be, if not evergreen, at least fairly broadly applicable and give a lot of flexibility to regulators and legislators in order to protect civil rights as we have tried to enshrine them in the United States. We'll leave that for another discussion, how successful we've been on that. As promised, the framework for an AI Bill of Rights comes out late in 2022, prior to ChatGPT and everywhere that we've been in the last year. To be noted that for the OSTP in the White House to deliver this had to start very early in the Biden administration. And it was a response to the evolving technology landscape. They were very much on top of this. And it's a first landmark, and it forms other actions from the executive branch. Some of the highlights from the sections, these are the 5 main sections that it covers. Safe and effective systems. Automated systems should be developed with consultation from diverse communities, stakeholders, and domain experts to identify concerns, risks, and potential impacts of the systems. Systems should undergo pre-deployment testing, risk identification, and mitigation, and ongoing monitoring that demonstrate they are safe and effective based on their intended use, etc. Algorithmic discrimination protection. Designers, developers, and deployers of automated systems should take proactive and continuous measures to protect individuals and communities from algorithmic discrimination and to use and design systems in an equitable way. This protection should include proactive equity assessments as part of the system design. Data privacy. You should be protected from violations of privacy through design choices that ensure such protections are included by default. In other words, rather than forcing you into a system that you have to opt out and find the way to opt out, systems are opt-in and transparent in what you're opting into and allow you to back out and pull your data out easily. Notice and explanation. Designers and developers and deployers of automated systems should provide generally accessible plain language documentation. Who's opened up an 80-page EULA and then just clicked, okay, I'll accept that, because who's got time to read 80 pages of legalese? But it should be clear language documentation with clear descriptions of the overall system functioning and the role that automation plays. Notice that such systems are in fact in use and that the individual organization responsible for this, it should also identify the individual or organization responsible for the system, etc. In other words, you should know how and why an outcome impacting you was determined by an automated system, including when the automated system is not the sole input determining the outcome. And finally, human alternatives, consideration, and fallback. You should be able to opt out from automated systems in favor of a human alternative where appropriate. And you should have access to timely human consideration and remedy by fallback and escalation process if an automated system fails. It produces an error, or you would just like to appeal or contest its impacts on you. None of the systems that we've talked about, none of the systems that are in play in hiring or in digital management are compliant with any of the elements of this within this framework. Now, one can argue a lot of these things predate it, but part of what this framework was to do was to give us something to start to move towards. Now, the executive branch has quickly followed in implementing this. The FTC has been the leading agency in the executive branch, and they have taken a very assertive stance to outline agency jurisdiction, and they've done so in a way like that initial Attorney General from DC, Karl Racine's legislation, keeping the type of technology out of the question. They are looking at outcomes of systems. And that is kind of a key approach that's being taken here. And we need to understand that, because hiring is a process or a system. Management now engages in systems as well. So these things are being divorced from specific technology so they can be applied broadly. There was a joint statement issued by the 4 agencies listed earlier in 2023. In it, the agencies note that the increasing commonness of automated systems in our daily lives. They draw explicit attention to using broader language of automated systems rather than the narrower AI, so that they can encompass any tool to automate workflows and help people complete tasks or make decisions. They note the prevalence of such systems in the decision-making processes in both public and private organizations, and how these decisions can impact individual rights and opportunities. And again, going back to Carl Racine's stuff, and directly referencing the OSTP's framework for on behalf of the White House. They do note that many of these tools offer promise for advancement, but they also have the potential to perpetuate unlawful bias, to automate unlawful discrimination, and to produce other harmful outcomes. And in that, they identified 3 areas of guidance and areas of enforcement: data and data sets, model opacity and access, and design and use. And they get into more details in those things. I would encourage you to kind of go find that. It's an amazing resource, just like the framework is. And while these agencies are taking strong stances within their spheres of coverage within the government, they are looking to not just kind of be the big stick. They are mostly issuing guidance. So organizations that are operating in good faith have an idea of what decisions to make, what directions to go in, so they can build more robust systems and put in place things that allow them to audit and keep an eye on these systems and make sure they're doing what they're intended to do without causing harms. White House does the framework for the AI Bill of Rights in late 2022. Summer of 23, Chuck Schumer launches the SAFE initiative after 6 or 7 months of talking about doing something. He gets that out there. That's not a knock on him, just poor wording on my part there. But he delivers the SAFE initiative. What's interesting with this is, while the White House framework is focused on that Civil Rights Foundation, Schumer's SAFE initiative takes the civil rights piece and puts economic development on the same level as that. This is a shift in kind of how that side of Washington is now engaging with things. And it has, the Biden White House has kind of moved towards more embracing of that component, the economic side of things. The May 16th Senate Judiciary Committee hearing had OpenAI CEO Sam Altman, computer scientist and NYU Professor Emeritus Gary Marcus, and IBM's Chief Privacy and Trust Officer Christina Montgomery. This was intended to be the first of a series of hearings, but most of the conversation focused on theoretical future harms while ignoring known and documented harms from algorithmic decision-making systems that are deployed now. Interestingly, and this is good context for how Washington does things, the legislators the night before attended a dinner with Sam Altman, but Gary Marcus and Christina Montgomery had not been invited. So there's that. Conversation did lean towards the development of a regulatory body in the US similar to the FDA, or possibly something like the International Atomic Energy Agency, if we were looking beyond our own borders. Following the hearing, many people that have been following this space expressed concern of regulatory capture, that the current few technology companies that were publicly at the front of AI and development in the US would influence the process to favor themselves and lock out competition, while minimizing their own liability for known harms, pushing those downstream to users. So if you were to use an AI system that they had developed in working on, say, your lab, or in a research space, and something was faulty in that and you didn't catch it, that's on you. That's not on them for building a bad algorithm. So you have to be as attentive and as knowledgeable in the algorithmic systems as they do. And incidentally, when Altman was asked during the hearings about projected job loss or workforce upheaval, he put the responsibility for mitigating that on the government. Nobody in Congress in that hearing challenged that idea. But keep in mind other things I've shared about the history of things, where kind of Silicon Valley tends to think about and how they think about labor. State legislatures in the past year or two, dozens of them, a dozen plus of them, have started to deploy legislation or work on legislation. Like the preceding documents I've covered, these are tech agnostic documents, and these are in red states and blue states. So progress is slow for some of them, but this is a bipartisan issue, or at least it has been up until now. And of course, the European Union with GDPR and their more recent AI policies have kind of put them at the forefront of the global community on regulatory and policy frameworks that are actually enforceable in specific ways. Now, what we're all here for, what our students are facing. In the past 20 years, applicant tracking systems have radically altered the hiring process. As new components come into those, as new tools become available to human resource folks, to the talent acquisition people, they have been able to make their process more efficient. What sometimes happens, what often will happen, is that efficiency on the human side means those teams get smaller, or at least don't grow relative to the workload. So the efficiencies don't actually make less work for the HR folks. They're kind of static, but those efficiencies tend to shift more work to the applicants. And in addition to moving more work to the applicants, some of the newer tools that are coming out are also making the process less transparent for our applicants. So think about the last time you were on the job hunt and how frustrating that was. And now remove one or two stages from your ability to learn more about the organization you're trying to get into. Imagine a university that you can only find out what's on their website, but they eliminate some of the interview process as a two-way conversation. You're delivering information to them, but they're not giving you an equivalent. But that more work has been measured. It takes more time and energy for an applicant today than it did 5 or 10 years ago. I've seen that with the students we work with here. We've seen it as in our field at large, and it's across all spectrum of the workforce. It's not just college students and grad students coming out. Everybody is facing a bigger workload challenge. And the process is morphed so much that a lot of their students, I've got a running joke with my students, and you can have this running joke with them too. It's like, don't listen to your uncle telling you to take a resume door to door, right? And I get enough laughs when I mention that to students that I know that advice is still going out there at Thanksgivings and so on. This idea that the old ways of job searching don't work anymore. I saw a recruiter in a public forum say if they had 2 equal candidates and one was on LinkedIn, one wasn't, they would automatically favor the one on LinkedIn. Now, fortunately, in that public space, a lot of people, recruiters and otherwise, jumped in that conversation and said, hey, that's discriminatory because that person might not be on LinkedIn because of personal safety issues or data privacy issues. That's a terrible metric to use. But the fact is, there are expectations that have come along with the technology. You've got to be on LinkedIn. Otherwise, who are you? Where are you? You need to be findable through Google or other search engines. Otherwise, we can't trust the information you've given us. These are biases that have entered our process because the technology has shaped what we're looking at, and it's what our students are up against. Video interviewing was already emerging prior to the COVID lockdown, got supercharged through that process for obvious reasons. But video interviewing went from just having conversations over Zoom, which, keep in mind, if somebody didn't have a fake background up or they didn't pay attention to what was in their background, the interview is now happening in their personal space. If it's 2020, that interview is occurring in their bedrooms, in their kitchens, in their living rooms, where personal information that is not that employers are not normally privy to suddenly had access to. We had to pivot in what we were teaching students in terms of what's in your background. Make sure it's neutral or is otherwise not going to negatively impact, because this is an activity that's happening in a space that is not where interviews typically happen. But video interviews have moved past that. I mentioned Zoom, exploring facial recognition and reading technologies. HireVue, which is one of the biggest interview companies out there, they're used by most of the Fortune 100 for interviewing. They've backed off of some of these claims a bit, but they tout that they're going to be able to give you an emotional profile of the applicant based on the video interview. Again, the science isn't there to really support that, but they're making these claims in spaces where it's not easy to challenge them. And how would you like to go for an in-person interview, or what you think is an in-person interview? You arrive on campus and the HR person ushers you into a small room and you're facing Tenge. Tenge was launched in Sweden prior to COVID, and this is actually used. That face will actually move while it's talking to you, and it will record your answers. So the human-to-human interview that we're used to is being slowly replaced by automation, not just through Zoom, but even where we would expect an in-person interaction to be. Remember, this is taking away power from our students as applicants, because if I'm talking to the bot, how much is the bot going to be able to tell me about the organization and give me a feel for what it's really like to be there? If I ask it a hard question, it's going to give me an automated answer, but I'm not going to be able to read the facial expression to determine, did that question make the interviewer uncomfortable? Did I touch a sore spot with their organization? I need that information as an applicant to decide what I want to do. Also, on the less creepy side, but no less infuriating for students and other applicants, is the video interviewing, where you go in as an applicant, HR will send you a link, you go into a system, and you will have text or video prompts, and it will record those. These are replacing screening, phone screening and video screening interviews. So one stage of the interview process, sometimes more, we're losing that human interaction, that ability to connect with a person regarding the job. We lose the chance to learn from that person what it's like to be there and decide, is this a place for me? Are these people I want to work with? Assessments have been a part of hiring for decades, going back to post-World War I, when the assessments that were used to figure out where enlistees and draftees would be deployed, where they'd be trained. But we've now seen the technology allow these to be deployed as games, little mini games. There's a few companies that are doing this. It's very common now for applicants to, in the application process, possibly before somebody's even looked at their materials, to receive an email prompting them to go to a site and do some games. And these games will assess things like how risk averse you are. They try to get at what your decision-making processes are like, and other things. They are about aptitudes, but they're also trying to get at attitudes. Now, what happens if you're somebody that hates playing online games and you have to go and do this? Is that going to impact your performance? Hasn't been validated. So we run into these problems, but the assessments aren't new, and these have been a problematic space in hiring for decades as well. But there's very clear legislation on that, but this has not yet been applied into these new tools that are out there. I think some of them are going to have some great validity and be very powerful, but this is unknown space yet. We're also seeing more artificial intelligence being used in employee onboarding. 5 or 6 years ago, there was a piece about Unilever was deploying this. So new hires, you wouldn't have like a new employee buddy, or you wouldn't go to your boss. You were told to go to a chat bot to get all your answers about working for Unilever. What's your experience as an employee if they're saying, don't talk to a person, talk to the bot? They've told you something about who they are as an organization and what their value set is. but it's also cutting you off from really engaging that community. And we've seen also over COVID, especially the ramping up of employment surveillance technologies. And there's people that are finding ways to game them, and it's hilarious to go, see somebody on Twitter or whatever saying, yeah, I was at a diner 4 days a week, and I had a little thing that would jiggle my mouse periodically, so it would look like my, and I was doing it remotely, so it looked like I was at my desk. And if somebody walked by my desk, I just happened to be gone for a moment, but it looked like activity was happening, whatever. But the fact is, we have seen a dramatic rise. Now, surveillance of employees isn't new, but the technology is giving new ways to do this. And the hiring process being more high tech as well, and using a lot of these algorithms and AI systems, often to determine or to front load what a decision should be, means we're seeing employees facing some systems where they can be terminated or be written up for something the algorithm has detected, but the human beings have not. So a manager doesn't even need to be engaged with their employees. They're getting a readout, and then they're pushing a button to take action. Or they go and have a hard conversation, but they haven't actually had an interaction that told them that hard conversation is necessary. The system told them that was necessary. But if you're onboarded, being told, go talk to the chat bot, it kind of makes sense that you'd be managed the same way. I am not going to, this is a whole other session, this is a whole hour, but when we talk about ethical considerations, in higher ed, we tend to be either here or we're at the level of academic integrity. But depending on the systems in question, there is research pointing to environmental impact. These systems are freshwater hungry. They need enormous amounts of energy to run. The intellectual property infringement issue is massive, and there are lawsuits against OpenAI and others. If OpenAI loses the lawsuit to the New York Times, that entire database for ChatGPT could be deleted per US law, which means ChatGPT ceases to exist and has to be rebuilt. For example, I suspect we wouldn't see the courts go that far because that would be seen as disruption, kind of a AI version of the too big to fail that we saw in 2008 when the automakers were bailed out. But all of these are layers of ethics that are engaged when we're talking about artificial intelligence. And there are experts that are addressing each of these. The labor abuses typically is offshored, but we're seeing the behaviors of some of the companies building this towards their own employees that are in the United States as well. And the technologies lend themselves to that, because as you start to put layers of technology between you and your workforce, it's very easy to kind of let the algorithm take care of the unpleasantness. I'm finishing with this. WGA strike. Like the Google walkouts back in 2017, this is an example of white-collar, college-educated professionals in or adjacent to creative roles, organizing and explicitly naming harms in AI in their employment space, in their expectations from employers in the job market. And I think it's notable that they not only struck, they won this. They gained the concessions they needed. And I think it's an example for how we as employees, we as instructors and educators of the future workforce can be talking to our students about what can be done, where their power may be, because the algorithmic systems will continue to shift their ability to learn what they need to in hiring and to control their employment away from them, unless there's a response. And that response cannot be coordinated on an individual level. We simply do not, individually, we simply do not have the ability to push back against these things. So, but there's hope. Also, this is notable because a prevailing narrative is the inevitability of AI. First of all, which AI are you talking about? That never gets mentioned, and that's a key question. But also, this proves it's not inevitable. Control and the shaping can fall back to the people who are most impacted by these things. It's not something that's just going to roll over it and we have to adapt. We can adapt it to what our needs and expectations are as well. The question is, for the US, will this be an anomaly, or will this be kind of something that becomes a focal point for how the rest of us can address this? And if we're feeling like, well, we're educators, we're not creators, we are very much creative class people in the work we do. Everything we do is creation. We create syllabi, we create curricula. We are creators. Research is an intensely creative endeavor. So I would encourage us all to think like we're creators, the way that they see themselves as creators, and how we engage with our work, and what AI could mean to the work we do, quality of it, and the impact of it. A little bit longer than I wanted, but I hope that was informative, and I am now at your disposal.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was great. Questions? Do people have questions?
Well, thanks very much, Chris. For those colleagues who aren't aware, Chris is a Jefferson colleague of mine, and want to acknowledge and thank him for all his great efforts on behalf of our students. And speaking of students, where you were leading us as you went through your talk, you had our career counseling center. Sometimes we hear people telling students, this is here, it's inevitable, there'll be more and more of it, so they should think about careers or tweaking their careers in a way that is AI resistant. So the human element becomes critical to whatever that position would be. Is there such a thing?
That's a great question. I was just reading yet another piece today that was here's what we have to do. We have to focus more on human-centered work, right? The human-centered skills are what's going to be where everybody goes. Well, first of all, what does that do for people who are neurodiverse or have anxiety disorders or otherwise do not thrive in those intensely person-to-person spaces? Where do they go in the workplace? Second, this research that's going on in these spaces actually betrays that as being viable. Japan has a national endeavor to automate and roboticize elder care. It's not being received very well, which is kind of funny because Japan is considered to be the most tech-friendly culture in the world. But a researcher, an anthropologist, I think at MIT, who's been studying that process over the last few years, was shocked to discover there's pushback on that. Both the workers and the residents of their elder care facilities are like, we don't want these automated things. They disrupt us actually working with people, but they're there as a replacement because the Japanese government has said a number of years ago, our aging population means we have to automate this, or we're importing labor, which is bringing other people in. But we also we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, research and tools deployed into the marketplace that offload parental care. Have a little bot that will talk to your kid about their day at school because you're busy making dinner. Well, that's an intensely human space and interaction, but we just automated it. The same thing is happening across all sectors. Infant care being roboticized and seeing AI being brought in. We will start to see the combining of Boston Dynamics style robots with some of these AI systems to automate things as well. The push is there. The desire is there to automate and roboticize a lot of this stuff where they're in the spaces we think are supposed to be protected status or, protected skill sets. So, and the concern is, we can say, well, these are human spaces, so they're safe. But the reality is things don't need to be as good as when a human provides it. It needs to be good enough to be tolerable to the marketplace. That's what's going to be the decider. That's how our economic system operates. So I think it's a space to like retreat to for some of us, but that's not ultimately a winning scenario. I think it's more looking at what's a WGA style response within our own areas and carve that space out and say, these are the things that will not be automated because. And that might mean taking on inefficiencies, but also figuring out new ways to do things as well. But I'm not that hopeful, and I used to buy into that argument and teach this is what we need to do. But as I started to look at it, I'm like, this is not sustainable. And there are researchers and organizations that are looking to move in, are already actively trying to move into those spaces. So, and what we've seen, there's one of the major national therapist organizations is looking at using chat bots to fill the gap for mental health needs. So you get a chatbot counselor instead of a real counselor, which on the one hand, the argument is we don't have enough counselors. People don't have access to the mental health they need. But ChatGPT had only been out, I think, 3 months when a gentleman in the Netherlands or Belgium committed suicide after talking to a chatbot. Now, there's a lot more to that, but that's deploying an automated system into a space rather than fixing the underlying problem. We're just deploying this because it's cheaper. But to your question, if we're willing to deploy chatbots to replace humans in something that's that intensely human, there is no real boundary that we can kind of step behind and say we're safe here, unless we set that boundary ourselves and we form it as a place of resistance, if you will. To make our jobs resistant, we actually resist.
Yeah, that's kind of scary. I would think it would be better the robot does the cooking and the mother takes care of the kids. So I think we just have to have better decision making than where a robot could be efficient and really help us and be very careful about these human interactions that are essential, that we don't replace them with that type of system.
I agree.
I'd like one of those cooking robots at my house, actually.
Me too.
Christine's asking about the AI Bill of Rights and if it's enforceable. The AI Bill of Rights was intended to be a framework to guide U.S. federal agencies on response. I think the goal is to start to bring it into a legislative space eventually so it will become enforceable. But what we're seeing with the agencies like the EEOC and the FTC is they're enforcing the concepts of it according to what their responsibility of their agencies are within the public sphere. So the FTC can say, hey, if you're using a chat bot to, and you're not paying attention to it and it's defrauding customers because of the way you've set it up, we can come after you because that's what we do. It doesn't matter that it's a chat bot. Your company is responsible for defrauding customers because of the tools you've used. You made a choice and there's a responsibility that goes there. New York Times case, there are some other cases against OpenAI, but that's the biggest one and likely to be the most effective. There are a lot, I think there's at least one class action, possibly multiple against OpenAI, also against some of the other big players in this space. But the NYT one is the only large entity against large entity lawsuit. The others are class actions of small content creators. So artists and authors who discovered that ChatGPT had helped itself to their content without informing them, without getting their consent, and without compensation.
So why only the New York Times? Why not other publications also? I mean, like any publications, science,
Yep.
Any of your scientific journals, any of your news, any of anything?
That's a very good question. And because I am not a legal scholar, I don't know. My guess is a lot of them, because of the cost of this, a lot of places are waiting to see how that one goes. My suspicion is it's a lot of, when that case finally comes to trial, it's going to really depend on what administration we have chosen in November. And I suspect the New York Times case, best case, I don't think we're going to get what I consider a base case scenario. I think it's probably going to fall somewhere close to an eminent domain argument to, well, they did it, nobody else gets to do it in the future, but we're going to let this one pass. But if the New York Times wins, I think we will see more if it's necessary, but it could also break OpenAI and completely devalue it from Microsoft's standpoint. So Microsoft would probably distance itself fairly quickly, because that would be a huge loss for them as well. But we need to keep in mind the history of large technology corporations in lawsuits. And when they've gone up against the United States, you know, the repercussions haven't been particularly impactful over the long term. But I think it's the cost of I think the cost it would take for the NYT case that others are waiting to see. But I would suspect, I haven't checked in on this in a while, but I would suspect that a lot of organizations are doing Friends of the Court briefs in support of the New York Times.
So I have one more question because I know we're out of time, but so just like how regulations are very like international based, like how do you operate as a company like in Europe where the privacy laws are so different, or in like China where everything is so different? If you're a company and where the company is will determine who's going to determine what the rules are going to be.
Yeah. So when the European Union was looking at GDPR, to put that, it got a lot of resistance from the tech companies, mostly led by Facebook, now Meta, saying it was going to be completely untenable to do business in Europe if this got approved. Well, it got approved and they kept doing business. They localized, and they have the power to localize. They just don't want to. It's the same. I grew up in Michigan. So it's the same as the auto industry saying seatbelts are going to be too expensive to put in cars. Can't be done. Well, we got seatbelts, and it's a good thing. So, you know, they know how the companies know how to localize. They know how to do that. China's a completely different beast because there's so much government involvement in their tech sector in very different ways than in Europe or in the United States. But our tech companies, which are kind of driving this in the Western sphere, they know what to do. They also lobbied very heavily against the AI framework that the European Union just passed in the past couple of months. But most of that still got through. There were some concessions, but they figure out how to adjust, and they will, as they always have. And I mean, companies before technology were doing the same thing, you know, with food products and everything else. It's just what you've got to do business. And they know they need that market. Good question, though.
Marcel, you're muted.
Thank you, Jerry. No, thank you, Chris, so much for giving us your time and giving such a wonderful presentation. This was really interesting. I think there's a lot of things that are going on that I know I was completely unaware of. So this was a fascinating presentation.
Yeah. The first iteration of this I gave about a year ago at a conference, and I actually started with, or there was a slide right at the beginning. It was just like how much changed in the 3 weeks between my, you know, one milestone in the actual delivery. Like I had to add slides in and say, by the way, this just happened 2 weeks ago. I had not prepared for that. You know, so it's fast moving. There are a lot of moving parts. It's really difficult. I mean, I'm not surprised we're moving the way we are. It's very hard to wrap our heads around all of these pieces. That's why I think it's much more, we can't do this singularly. I think as faculty looking at what do we do in our classes or in our programs, it's got to be group effort and institutional effort to figure this out and kind of shape a path that's actually taking care of our students and ourselves as human beings. There's some very cool tools out there, but how we use it, how what we put into it is being used, and all of that. There's a ton more on that front, but it's amazing and scary.
Most definitely. Well, thank you again, Chris. We really appreciate it. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Everyone have a great rest of your afternoon.
Good to see everybody. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.